So I need to make 2 points that address this objection. The first is based on retrocausation, and the second is based on our ability to disprove local realism. Daryl Bem has done multiple precognition experiments. It's obviously the case that paranormal ability is repeatable in these circumstances, as the odds are 74 billion to 1 that these results are just from chance alone. The lower highlighted part describes subliminal messages that were shown to the subjects after they had already made a decision about a certain image. In other words, a subliminal message that is positive has a positive impact on someone's decision, even if it is shown after the decision is made. A subliminal message directly affects the subconscious mind, by the way. So if an event that is going to happen in the future affects a decision that is made in the present, that is what we call retrocausation. Retrocausation is also a theory that is popular in quantum mechanics. Avshalom Elieser's explanation of retrocausation is fairly easy to understand even for people who are not familiar with quantum mechanics. It is the idea that any quantum state is disturbed from its natural state when we measure it. This disturbance travels into the future but also travels into the past, as it has now become impossible for the quantum state to give different outcomes than the one we already have. I think it's helpful to look at this from the perspective of a double-slit experiment. It's basic quantum mechanics that individual particles can act as a wave or as individual particles. By measuring for a wave, we will find that they act as a wave. Likewise, if we measure them as individual particles, we will find that they act differently than wave. So if we decide in the future to measure some particles in relation to a wave, the movement of the particles in the past is forced to align with the wave outcome that we have given it. I don't feel the need to make an indisputable argument supporting retrocausation. Regardless of what theory is used to explain the effect is still real because we can observe it. Likewise, theories only exist because there is still uncertainty. For all we know, multiple explanations of quantum effects may be simultaneously true in different specific circumstances. I should mention that the Nobel Prize that was awarded in 2022 was given to 3 scientists who disproved the theory of local realism. This is incredibly important because it means that reality at the quantum level is not at all consistent, and therefore realism is not fundamental. We already knew that time and space are also relative and not fundamental. Therefore, we can conclude that at the very core of everything, the quantum level, it's inherently variable and not definite. We can't rely on classical or materialistic theories anymore because they are fundamentally and demonstrably incomplete. They simply don't accurately describe the world. Let's circle back around to the objection against instant communication of information based on general relativity. Since quantum effects literally supersede local reality and therefore supersede time and space, the general relativity argument is not really relevant. Since we have already shown that human consciousness has special quantum properties that non-living things don't have, I'm going to talk more about why consciousness is special. First of all, there is what is called the hard problem of consciousness. This is the question of how subjective experience can arise from physical brain processes. Some people have made the argument that this is not really a problem at all, the idea being that we are somewhat confused about consciousness. The argument is made that consciousness is something like an illusion that our intuition tells us is something that is more than just what our bodies have created. We understand that optical illusions confuse our perception, so it could be the case that our fundamental bodily limitations may also confuse our perception. I don't find this to be a really good explanation because to make the argument that our perception is flawed, we would have to accept that some level of consciousness must exist in order to have perception in the first place. Consciousness is a term that describes a certain kind of awareness, so defining a special kind of awareness as simply as an illusion doesn't solve the hard problem of consciousness, as it only provides a deflection. Consciousness as we know it is a kind of subjective experience that some creatures have and other things don't. No rock will ever have the subjective experience of pain, for example, because they are simply not conscious. I have to mention Michael Graziano specifically. He states that no creature actually has consciousness as we are familiar with. Consciousness as we know it, he derogatively refers to as a sort of magical essence. He also states that there is no methodology based on the common understanding of consciousness that anyone can come up with that will actually determine if creatures have consciousness. This is part of his criticism of current philosophy and neurology. This criticism is blatantly wrong, as we have shown that some humans and some animals have a concept of self with the dot test. The dot test is putting a dot on a creature, and if that creature notices that it has a dot on it, then it must therefore have a concept of itself that does not include the dot. Graziano essentially redefines what we call consciousness as a self-model, and admits that some creatures have this feature. This is not particularly insightful or helpful. Then he says that we aren't really sure which creatures have self-models, but at least we have an approachable answer for this question. The dot test, by the way, is an approachable answer to the question of standard consciousness as we know it, so Graziano's statement falls flat. He also makes a straw man argument about how at least we don't need some sort of magic meter that can measure consciousness waves or magic essence coming out of something. This statement is particularly revealing because to prove that his ideas are actually useful at all, he feels he has to attack a technique and technology that doesn't exist. His criticism of the common understanding of consciousness as being a magical way of thinking is the fallacy of appealing to incredulity. This is a method of superficially dismissing the unique characteristics of consciousness without having to make a valid argument. Graziano also says that it's circular logic to hold the belief that you could say that you have a conscious experience simply because you feel like you do so. We can disprove this label of circular logic by pointing out that the realization that you are having a subjective experience is a purely factual matter. No rock has ever observed that it can think, therefore only things that can think can come to the realization that they are capable of self-reflection. Avshalom Elitzur describes the thought experiment that disproves the idea that qualia, or the subjective individual experience of consciousness, is simply a misperception. It's rather hard to follow as written, so I'll state it more simply. If the laws of perception are physical laws, then there should be a difference in the actions of someone who has only physical perception compared to the actions of someone who has subjective experience as well. Someone who lacks subjective experience would not be able to comprehend what it would be like for someone who has subjective experience. Therefore, if someone lacks subjective experience, then they would be incapable of asking the question why they feel like they have subjective experience. So we can conclude that subjective experience does exist, and the reason that we know it does is because it is functionally different than only physical perception, and this is demonstrated by the fact that we are capable of such introspective thoughts in the first place. He concludes that consciousness is a non-physical thing. It's a subjective experience, and it is influencing human actions. Therefore, he states that if mass or energy can be subtracted or added to the universe by a non-physical force, this must violate conservation laws. He argues that since subjective experience is systematic and not random, it must be a consistent thing that uses energy. But if it's non-physical, this would violate conservation laws. However, he provides an exception if quantum mechanics is ultimately responsible for the creation of the subjective experience in the brain. I see this as another example of rigid concepts preventing people from seeing the matter clearly. If we only looked at the supernatural aspects of consciousness and used the unhelpful scientific definition of natural, then we would naturally come to the conclusion that the consciousness is fundamentally supernatural and that this is proof that conservation laws can be violated. Yes, paranormal effects are real, and they aren't physical like electromagnetic waves, but that doesn't mean that they are some force that is totally beyond our comprehension. It seems that they are both natural to most, if not all living creatures, and part of a foundational aspect of our reality. This is a small tangent, but the idea that something could violate conservation laws is already mainstream, because we know that the expansion of our universe already violates those laws. The problem with that objection is that these laws are not literal rules, but are descriptions of what we observe and what we believe to be true. We already know that the quantum is not adhering to the rules of classical physics, and our observations in the real world tell us that consciousness also seems to break certain rules. These sort of laws are really just descriptions of what we believe reality to be, and there can be exceptions to them. For example, the theoretical physicist Nima Arkani Hamad explains that space-time is doomed as a concept. He says that if space-time is something that is real, then we can meaningfully talk about any arbitrary measurement of time or space that we like. This is not the case, because if we try to look at something extremely small, we use a lot of energy, and this gets to the point where we end up collapsing a small region of space-time into a black hole. Since we know that classical physics and time-space always break down at this level, we know that the laws that people think are inviolable are not foundational. Since I have mentioned the non-locality of the paranormal with telepathy and the retrocausation aspect in relation to psychic powers, we can conclude that these two things directly line up with the non-locality and retrocausation aspects of quantum mechanics. People don't generally understand how the paranormal works, and they don't understand how fundamental and natural it is. The image I'm showing you is from an experiment that involved 15 chicks kept in a cage in a dark room. The chicks don't like to be in the dark, and there was a lighted candle placed on a robot. The robot was controlled by a computer that made it move around randomly. In the control experiments, the robot did move around randomly as one would expect. However, the desire of the chicks caused the robot to stay in the chick half of the range for 57 out of 80 chick experiments. And we can conclude it is natural for the desire of a conscious creature to influence chance events in a specific and repeatable way. Chickens are nowhere near as smart as humans, so it's obviously not high intelligence or some sort of philosophical or spiritual mindset that allows the chicks to manipulate the surrounding world with their intent. Since we understand that what we call the paranormal is a quantum influence, and we know how it affects the world, this serves as a building block for the next question. How do we use this understanding to figure out how to use the paranormal more effectively? I intend to try to answer that question in my next video.